In April 1942, Western China, edge of the Taklamakan Desert. The desert was a living thing. It breathed in whispers and sighed in heat. As the first light of dawn crept over the dunes, the wind carried with it the scent of sand and old secrets. Elizabeth Harrington drew her scarf tighter around her face and gazed out toward the endless horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond that golden emptiness, her husband had vanished. 3 months ago, his last telegram had arrived from Kashgar, found something extraordinary. It could change everything. We'll send details soon. Then silence. Now it was her turn to follow his trail. Elizabeth had not been a spy nor an explorer. She had been a linguist, fluent in Mandarin, Uyghur, and bits of Russian, who had once spent evenings cataloguing pottery shards beside her husband Arthur in dusty tents under the stars. But when the British consulate in Chongqing received word that Arthur had gone missing near an archaeological site rumoured to contain an ancient map, everything changed. That map, according to intelligence leaks, revealed oil deposits hidden deep beneath Mongolian soil, oil that the Japanese desperately needed for their war effort. And so, the mission was reborn. Retrieve the map before the Empire of Japan could claim it. No soldier had volunteered. Only Elizabeth had stepped forward. Her journey began with a rickety bus rumbling through the desert's edge. The passengers, traders, farmers, a few weary soldiers, barely noticed her. She wore a simple brown coat, a headscarf, and carried a satchel that seemed far too heavy for a woman travelling alone. Inside were Arthur's notebooks, her travel papers, and a small revolver she barely knew how to use. Each mile brought her closer to Kashgar, the old Silk Road city that once hummed with life, now a crossroads of fear. Chinese nationalist troops guarded the streets, Soviet advisors watched from tea-houses, and Japanese spies, she was told, walked in plain clothes listening. At the checkpoint outside the city, a nationalist officer stopped the bus. "Papers!" he barked. Elizabeth handed over her travel pass, signed by the British consul himself. The officer's eyes lingered on her name, then on her face. "You are Mrs. Harrington?" he asked slowly. "Yes," she said calmly, forcing a smile. "You were searching for your husband?" She hesitated. "I am continuing his research." Nothing more. The officer studied her for a moment longer before waving her through. But as the bus lurched forward, Elizabeth caught sight of a man near a sand-coloured car watching her closely. Japanese, she guessed, from his tailored suit and unreadable eyes. He lifted a cigarette to his lips without breaking his stare. She knew then that her arrival had not gone unnoticed. Kashgar was a maze of noise and dust. Markets overflowed with silks, spices and whispers in a dozen languages. Elizabeth found lodging in a small inn near the old city walls where the owner, an elderly Uyghur woman, gave her a single candle and a warning. "There are ghosts in this city," the woman said. "Not of the dead, but of those who pretend to be alive." That night, Elizabeth sat at the wooden desk and opened Arthur's last notebook. Between sketches of pottery and fragments of ancient Chinese, one passage stood out. The cave lies north of Aksu, hidden by the whispering dunes. The monks spoke of it as the mouth of heaven, sealed with stone and silence. Inside, the old map, but someone else seeks it too. They call him the Falcon. She had never heard the name before. But the next morning, when she visited the British contact in the city, she learned who, or rather what, the Falcon was. Captain Henry Miles, a thin, weary man with a perpetual smell of tobacco, poured her tea and closed the shutters. "The Falcon," he said grimly, "is Captain Hiroshi Takeda of the Kempeitai, Japanese secret police,
Ruthless, methodical, fluent in every language under the sun. If he's here, he's already 2 steps ahead of us." Elizabeth's stomach turned cold. "Then he'll be after the cave." "After you," Miles corrected. "Arthur's notes mention you more than once. If Takeda intercepted them, he knows you're the key." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Miles handed her a folded map. "There's a contact in Aksu, a trader named Osman. He owes us a favor. He'll get you as far as the Tian Shan foothills. From there, you'll have to find the cave yourself."
Elizabeth tucked the map into her satchel and nodded. "And if Takeda finds me first?" Miles looked at her gravely. "Then God help you, Mrs. Harrington." 2 days later, she was on the road again, this time by camel caravan, following the old Silk Road north. The sun scorched by day, and the cold bit through her bones by night. Osman, her guide, was a quiet man who spoke little English, but his eyes carried centuries of desert wisdom. Once, as they rested near a cluster of ruined stupas, he asked softly, "You go for gold? Many foreigners come for gold." "No," Elizabeth said, staring at the horizon. "I go for truth." Osman smiled faintly. "Truth is heavier than gold, harder to carry." That night, under the wide sky, Elizabeth dreamed of Arthur, standing at the mouth of a cave, calling her name through the wind. But behind him a shadow moved, tall, thin, precise. When she woke, the fire had gone out. Footprints led away from the camp. The next morning, Osman was gone. His camel tracks vanished into the dunes. On the sand near the fire pit, Elizabeth found a single feather, black and thin. The falcon was real, and he was close. By noon, she had to make a choice, turn back toward Kashgar or continue alone. She stared at the horizon until the heat shimmered like smoke, then took a deep breath and adjusted her scarf. The desert whispered around her, a low hum like ancient voices carried by the wind. Each step forward sank into centuries of forgotten stories, of traders and conquerors and dreamers. And somewhere beyond, in the hollow of some hidden cave, lay a secret that could tilt the war. Elizabeth's hand brushed the revolver at her side. For the first time, she felt its weight not as fear, but as resolve. "If you found the cave, Arthur," she murmured, "I'll find it too." She turned her back to the tracks that led home, and walked straight into the unknown. April 7th, 1942, Aksu, Western China. The town of Aksu was a mirage that refused to fade. From afar, it shimmered like a silver dream, but up close, it was dust, fear, and the quiet hum of war. Elizabeth Harrington reached the edge of the marketplace just as a sandstorm began to die. Her camel groaned as she dismounted, legs trembling from days in the saddle. She brushed the grit from her coat and looked around. The narrow streets buzzed with traders, shouting in Uyghur, Russian, and Chinese. Every glance felt like a question, every whisper like a warning. She had been told to find Osman's cousin, a trader named Rahim, who ran a small shop selling watches and words. That phrase had been written in Captain Miles's careful hand, a code, perhaps, or a warning. Elizabeth adjusted her scarf and made her way down the market as Western Lane until she saw it, a dim shop with a faded sign shaped like a clock. Inside, the smell of oil and tobacco filled the air. Behind the counter, an older man with a long white beard looked up, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. "You a lost traveller?" he asked in accented English. Elizabeth hesitated, then spoke the phrase Miles had given her. "I was told to come where time stands still." The man studied her face for a long moment before locking the door behind her. "Then you are the widow of the archaeologist." Her throat tightened. "He's not—" She caught herself. He may still be alive. Rahim sighed. Perhaps, but others look for him too. They came 3 days ago, soldiers who ask too many questions. They call themselves merchants. She didn't need to ask who they were. The Japanese, she whispered. Rahim nodded grimly. One man speaks perfect Chinese, polite, smiles too much. They call him Takeda-san. The name hit her like a blade drawn in silence. The Falcon. That night, Rahim hid her in the back room of the shop. He poured her hot tea and spread a tattered map across the table. This is the route your husband took, he said, pointing at the faint red line winding north through the mountains. But the cave, the one the old monks spoke of, it is here. He tapped near a jagged line of rock etched in pencil. Near the Black Gorge. Elizabeth leaned in. How far? 3 days by horse, Rahim said. If the weather holds, but there is danger. The mountains eat men who travel alone. I'm not alone, she said quietly, though her voice betrayed doubt. Rahim looked at her for a long time, then smiled faintly. You have his courage, but courage is not armor. He slipped her a folded paper, a forged pass in Mandarin, bearing the seal of a local nationalist garrison. It will help you cross checkpoints, he said. And this. He handed her a small wooden charm carved in the shape of an eagle. Keep it. My father made it for travelers. Maybe it will fool the desert spirits. Elizabeth smiled. Or the living ones, she said softly. The next morning she was ready to leave, but as she stepped into the street she froze. A black car idled across the marketplace. Its windows were tinted, but she saw a man's silhouette in the front seat. Motionless, patient. The Falcon. Her heart pounded. She turned sharply into a side alley, pulling her scarf low over her face. The alley twisted through the back streets of Aksu. Mud walls, hanging laundry, barking dogs. She ducked into a pottery stall and waited, watching through a crack in the door. A few moments later, the man stepped out of the car. Tall, immaculate in a dark suit despite the dust, his hat low over narrow eyes. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and spoke to his men in crisp Japanese. Elizabeth didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. A hunter giving instructions. Her hands trembled as she gripped her satchel. If she stayed, Rahim would be questioned, maybe killed. She couldn't risk it. She slipped out through the back door and ran. By sunset, she had reached the edge of the desert again. The air grew colder, the dunes taller. She found an abandoned caravan station and lit a small fire in one of the old stables. Her camel, exhausted, chewed quietly beside her. She pulled Arthur A.S. notebook from her bag and studied his notes again. The monk said the cave sings when the wind is right. The walls echo like a living thing. What had he meant? A natural sound or something man-made? Before she could think further, she heard it, hoofbeats in the distance. She doused the fire and crouched low, heart racing. Through the crack in the wooden wall, she saw the faint glow of lanterns. A group of riders, Chinese soldiers perhaps, or worse. Then a voice cut through the cold, calm, polite, unmistakable. "Mrs. Harrington," said Captain Takeda, his English smooth as silk, "please, we need not hide from one another." He was close, too close. She could see the glint of his pistol under his coat. "You have something that belongs to us," he continued. "A map."
Hand it over, and you will be treated with respect. Resist, and I will have no choice. Elizabeth's pulse thundered. She scanned the room. Her revolver lay just beyond reach. Takeda's footsteps drew nearer. "Do you know what I admire about the British?" he said softly. "Their loyalty, even when it kills them." In one motion, Elizabeth lunged for her pistol. The shot cracked through the silence. The camels screamed. Takeda dove aside, a lantern shattered, flames leaping up the wall.
Smoke filled the air. She scrambled out the back, coughing, running toward the dunes as the station caught fire behind her. The wind roared, sand stinging her face. She didn't look back. By dawn she was miles away, exhausted, half blind from the storm. The desert stretched endlessly, but now she knew the truth. Takeda was following her trail, step for step. Somewhere ahead, beyond the black line of mountains, lay the cave, and the secret her husband died for. She tightened her grip on the wooden eagle charm and whispered, "Just a little farther, Arthur. I'll find it." Behind her, the smoke of the burning station rose into the pale sky, a signal to friend and foe alike. The falcon would come, but so would she. In April 11th, 1942, the Kunlun Mountains, western China. The mountains rose like broken teeth against the horizon. Elizabeth Harrington's breath fogged in the cold as she climbed the final ridge. The desert behind her had been silent, endless, but here, in the high passes, the wind spoke. It moaned through the rocks like a voice trapped between worlds. She paused beside a frozen stream, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Her hands were cracked and blistered, her lips split from days of wind and thirst. The camel had died 2 days ago, its bones already half buried by drifting sand. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Every step carried her farther from safety, deeper into the same path her husband had taken. Arthur's notebook was her compass. On one torn page, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "The cave sings, follow the sound." The sound was real. She could hear it now, faint, rhythmic, almost like breathing. She adjusted her scarf and pressed on. By noon she found the gorge. It was hidden between 2 cliffs, a narrow wound in the earth where the wind howled like a living creature. The entrance to the cave was smaller than she expected, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. She knelt, brushed away sand, and saw something that froze her heart, a metal tag half buried in dust. She wiped it clean and read the name, Lieutenant Arthur Harrington, RAF liaison. Her breath caught. He had been here. She closed her eyes, pressing the tag to her chest. "I'm here, Arthur," she whispered. "I found it." Then, gathering what little courage she had left, she crawled into the darkness. The air inside was cold and stale. Her lantern flickered, throwing shadows across the stone walls, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Drawings, thousands of them. The walls were covered with intricate symbols and faded murals, maps of rivers, mountain ranges, and strange circular patterns that looked almost astronomical. Some were ancient, carved centuries ago. Others were recent. She recognized Arthur's handwriting between the lines, notes scribbled in English, and Uyghur, oil deposits confirmed, Soviet interest high, Japanese scouts nearby. He had found it, the map to the hidden oil fields beneath Mongolia. But as she studied it, she realized something else. Arthur hadn't just been documenting ancient history. He had been encoding modern intelligence, troop movements, rail lines, and the positions of Allied agents disguised as archaeology. This cave wasn't just a discovery, it was a vault of secrets. Her lantern flickered again, and then a sound echoed behind her. Footsteps. She turned sharply, pistol raised. The beam of her lantern caught a figure at the entrance, tall, pale, eyes gleaming in the dark. Captain Takeda. He smiled faintly. "You have a talent for survival, Mrs. Harrington. I almost admire it." Her heart pounded. "How did you find me?" Takeda stepped closer, his voice calm. "Fire travels fast in the desert, and Rahim was cooperative." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "You killed him." He shrugged. He chose the wrong side of history. You need not do the same. He gestured at the walls. This map, it belongs to no empire. But power decides ownership, and the Empire of Japan will not allow it to fall into British hands. She backed away slowly. Arthur died to keep it from men like you. Takeda sighed.
A noble man, yes. He begged me to spare you, you know. The words hit her like a bullet. You saw him? Takeda nodded. At first I thought him a fool, but he refused to talk, even when the cave collapsed around him. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the light. You are braver than he was, Mrs. Harrington. But bravery will not save you. Elizabeth's hand trembled, but she tightened her grip on the pistol. Maybe not, she said, but this will. She fired. The bullet struck the rock near his shoulder, sending shards flying. Takeda stumbled, then lunged forward, knocking the gun aside.
They struggled, the lantern tumbling and shattering on the ground. Darkness swallowed them, the cave filled with chaos, echoes of scuffling feet, grunts, and the sharp ring of metal. Then came a crack, a section of wall splitting under the strain. The ceiling groaned. "Fool!" Takeda shouted. "You'll bury us both!" Elizabeth scrambled for her husband's notebook, clutching it to her chest. "Better buried than in your hands!" A thunderous rumble shook the cave. Rocks fell like rain. Dust filled her lungs. Takeda's voice faded beneath the roar of collapsing stone. Then, silence. When Elizabeth opened her eyes, everything was still. The air was thick with dust, the light from a small hole in the ceiling illuminating a narrow path to the surface. Takeda was gone, buried, perhaps, or worse. She coughed, forced herself to her feet, and looked around. The cave was half destroyed, but the central wall, the one with the map, was still intact. She tore out several of Arthur's sketches, rolled them tightly, and slipped them into her coat. The wind above howled again, the whispering that had guided her here. Inside, the air smelled of wet paper, ink, and sweat. The scent of war fought behind desks. Elizabeth Harrington sat at a long table, her hands trembling slightly as she passed a leather satchel to the officer across from her. "I have it," she said quietly. "Arthur's notes, the location of the Mongolian fields, and more." Colonel Geoffrey Maddox, a stern man with silver hair and a voice that sounded like gravel, opened the satchel and began flipping through the pages. He barely blinked. "My God," he murmured. "He did it." Elizabeth stared down at her tea, untouched. "He died for it." The colonel looked up, studying her face. "So did a great many, Mrs. Harrington, but this," he tapped the papers gently, "may shorten the war." He leaned back in his chair. "You've done the Empire a service." Elizabeth didn't answer. Outside, thunder rolled over the bay, and she could almost hear the desert wind again, the ghosts of the Kunlun whispering through her memory. Later, she found herself alone in the barracks, sitting by the window. The rain turned everything outside into a watercolor blur. On her lap lay Arthur's notebook, edges burned and pages stained. She traced one corner with her fingertip, the ink smudged but still legible. He had drawn a small bird in the margin, a falcon. Underneath it he had written, "Falco peregrinus, returns home no matter how far it flies." A message for her, maybe, or a warning, because not everything from the cave had been buried. 2 days later, the colonel called her back. The room was dim, lit by a single ceiling fan and the rhythmic clack of a typewriter. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "we have a problem." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, slightly grainy. It showed a man in a Japanese officer's uniform standing beside a truck in Burma. Captain Takeda. Elizabeth's throat tightened. That's impossible. He was buried in the cave. Maddox shook his head. Apparently not. Our agents in Mandalay confirm he's alive and moving east, toward the Yunnan border. He's looking for something. She stared at the photo. The edges of Takeda's face were shadowed, but the eyes, sharp, relentless, were unmistakable. He's looking for me, she said softly. The colonel didn't deny it. He knows you survived. More importantly, he knows you have the originals. Through the mist, she saw movement, dark uniforms, rifles glinting, Takeda's men. Then yawned a voice, calm and cutting through the rain. Elizabeth! Her blood ran cold. He was standing barely 30 yards away, coat soaked, hat tilted low. Enough running, Takeda said. You've done admirably, but it ends here. She raised her pistol, trying to steady her hands. You should have stayed buried. He smiled faintly. So should your husband. The jungle exploded in gunfire. Elizabeth fired twice, then dove behind a tree as bullets tore through the air. She ran, not away, but uphill, toward a ridge where the ground rose steeply. Behind her, Takeda shouted orders. Rain hammered the earth. Her boots slipped, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop until she reached the edge, a cliff overlooking a valley of mist. There was nowhere left to run. Takeda emerged from the trees, gun raised. The map, Mrs. Harrington. She clutched the satchel to her chest. You'll have to take it. He stepped closer. That's the idea. Then, from somewhere above, there was the sound of engines. Elizabeth looked up. A flight of P-40 Warhawks roared overhead, their wings marked with the flying tiger's insignia. The air trembled with their passing. Takeda looked up, stunned, and in that moment she moved. Elizabeth shoved the satchel into her coat, drew the pistol again, and fired. The shot struck his arm. He staggered, cursed, and she threw herself backward off the cliff. She fell into the fog. For a heartbeat, there was only air. Then cold water swallowed her whole. The river carried her downstream, tumbling and spinning until the world went black. June 10, 1942, the Himalayas, near the Yunnan border. The wind in the mountains sounded like whispers, long, low, and endless. It carried the voices of soldiers, traders, and ghosts of every empire that had ever crossed this rugged spine of earth. Elizabeth Harrington walked through that wind, her coat torn, her boots caked in ice. Her satchel, Arthur's satchel, was strapped tight against her chest, the map within wrapped in oilcloth. It had been weeks since the crash. She had been rescued by the Chinese resistance, ragged young men and women armed with worn rifles and the unshakable belief that the Japanese could be beaten. They led her through jungle, over rivers, and now into the thin air of the mountains. But she wasn't fleeing anymore, she was chasing. The path wound between cliffs and clouds. Sometimes, when the fog cleared, she could see the world below, green valleys, thin rivers shining like silver threads, and the black smudge of war creeping ever closer. At night, the temperature plunged. The guerrillas lit small fires, hidden from the air by overhanging rocks. Elizabeth would sit near the flame, rubbing her hands and reading Arthur's journal by the flickering light. He had left notes not just about geography, but philosophy. Small thoughts scribbled between lines of coordinates. Maps are not about finding treasure, one note said. They're about finding purpose. She smiled sadly. You always were a poet, Arthur. A young guerrilla named Shen noticed her reading. Your husband? He asked in broken English. Yes, she said softly. He believed knowledge was worth dying for. Shen nodded. Then you must live for it. By dawn, they were moving again. The group had grown smaller. Some stayed behind to guard the valleys. Only 4 remained to escort her now. They reached a high plateau, barren, windswept, dotted with ruined stone shrines. Beyond it, a narrow trail disappeared into the snow. That was where they found the wreckage of a truck, Japanese markings. Elizabeth froze. The ground nearby was littered with empty shells and footprints. Shen bent down, touching one of the tracks. "Fresh," he said.
"Maybe 1 day old." She tightened her grip on her revolver. "Then he's ahead of us." Takeda, the man who had murdered her husband, burned their discovery, and hunted her across 3 nations, was now somewhere in this wasteland, trying to reach the same goal. But the Allies weren't far behind either. A coded message delivered by a resistance courier had said that an American liaison officer, Major Calloway, was leading a small unit up from the Burma Road to meet her.
If she could reach him first, the map would be safe. If not, the war might shift in Japan's favor. That night, the snow began to fall. It wasn't gentle. It came sideways, carried by howling wind. The guerrillas built a shelter from canvas and stone, and Elizabeth huddled inside, shivering under blankets. Sleep came in fits. She dreamed of Arthur, standing in the cave again, dust swirling around him. He turned, smiling, but when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own.
"Elizabeth," he whispered, "he's coming." She woke to gunfire. Bullets ripped through the canvas. One of the guerrillas screamed. Shen shouted in Chinese, a command to scatter. Elizabeth grabbed the satchel and rolled into the snow, the cold biting like knives. Muzzle flashes lit the dark. Figures moved in the storm, shadowed, precise, Japanese soldiers. And then she saw him, Takeda. He emerged through the storm, calm, rifle slung across his shoulder. The same faint smile played on his lips.
"I told you it would end with us," he said in English. Elizabeth raised her pistol, hand shaking. "It ends here." He tilted his head. "No, it ends when you tell me what he hid." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and ran, toward the ridge where the world dropped away into mist and rock. Snow blinded her, but she knew the terrain now, knew there was a cave just beyond the ridge, a place she could make her stand. She reached it moments before he did. Inside, the air was still. The walls shimmered faintly, ancient murals, perhaps Buddhist or older, half buried by frost. She lit a flare, its red glow dancing over stone faces. Takeda entered behind her, pistol drawn. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. 2 survivors of a war neither had chosen. He lowered his gun slightly. "You could have stayed in England," he said. "You had no reason to follow him here." Elizabeth met his gaze. "I had every reason. You killed him." He exhaled slowly. "He was in the way. So am I." Her hand tightened on the pistol, but before either could fire, a deep rumble shook the cave. The flare flickered, a crack split the wall, ancient stone weakened by time and frost. Takeda glanced upward. "You've doomed us both." Elizabeth backed toward the altar at the center of the cave. On it lay a slab of stone carved with strange symbols, the ones Arthur had mentioned in his journal. She opened the satchel, spreading the map beside it. The pieces matched perfectly. The cave wasn't just a hiding place, it was the cipher itself. She traced the symbols with trembling fingers. The last coordinates, the location of the untouched Mongolian oil fields, revealed themselves as light from the flare struck the carvings. Takeda saw it too. His face twisted, awe and fury mingling. "Give it to me!" He lunged. The 2 struggled, the flare tumbling to the ground. It hissed, sputtering. Snow from the entrance blew in, stinging their faces. He was stronger, but she was desperate. She twisted, slammed her elbow into his chest, and fired. The gunshot echoed like thunder. Takeda fell, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading through his uniform. "You can't stop it," he gasped. "Someone else will find it." Elizabeth stood over him, breath ragged. "Maybe, but not you." She grabbed the map and struck the flare against it. Flames climbed fast, orange against the blue ice. The parchment curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Takeda's eyes widened. "You fool! You burned it!" "Yes," she said quietly, "because some things shouldn't be found." The cave rumbled again, louder this time. Cracks split across the ceiling. Elizabeth turned and ran, stumbling into the blizzard. Behind her, the mountain collapsed. When she awoke again, it was morning. The sky was clear, painfully blue. She lay in the snow near a rocky slope, her body aching. Smoke rose from the mountain behind her, where the cave had been. Footsteps crunched nearby. "Mrs. Harrington?" She turned to see a man in an American uniform, Major Calloway. He knelt beside her, relief flooding his face. "You're a hard woman to find." She managed a weak smile. "You're late." He chuckled. "You finished without us, I see." Elizabeth looked back at the ruins. "It's finished, all right." Calloway helped her to her feet. "We'll get you home?" She nodded, but her gaze lingered on the smoke curling from the mountain's heart. Somewhere beneath that stone lay the ashes of Arthur's discovery and Takeda's obsession. Weeks later, she sat aboard a transport ship bound for England. The sea stretched endlessly, calm and grey. She opened Arthur's notebook one last time. The pages were nearly empty now. Only one phrase remained, scrawled across the inside cover. "Some maps lead home." Elizabeth closed the book and smiled faintly. "Then I've made it." The horizon shimmered ahead, and for the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to rest,